Welcome to Booktopia TV. I'm John Purcell, and I'm here with Booker Prize winner and two-time Miles winner, Tom Keneally, to talk about his new book, Shame and the Captors. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you.
I have to admit I haven't finished Shame and the Captors. I've got to about 120, page 120. I really enjoyed the contrast straight away between your intro, where you describe the difference between the real town and of Cowra and the town you've set in to make sure that the people who are involved are not overly unhappy with you.
Yes.
And the switch in the tone, because I loved your book Homebush Boy, and I'm surprised not to find the jacket not with a copy of Gerald Manley Hopkins in its top pocket. I was really hoping to see that. Straight away I thought to myself, what a gift for a novelist, this story. When you break down who's involved, you look at all the different lines of story that are involved in the Cowra breakup. There'd be a novel in how the Japanese dealt with each other within the camp, the stories of how they got there. There's a novel within the Italians within that camp as well, and how they broke down and how their allegiance to fascism changed over the time. There's a novel in how the Australians dealt with it. You've combined them all brilliantly. Well, there's also the English and Australians combination as well. And then there's the land that's involved, the farming. Such a rich story to dive into. When you came across it, did you start thinking, how can I bring all this together?
No, I knew that all that would have to be in it, but I did it by, as writers do, by feel more than by plan. And of course, you feel your way through many drafts. So all those elements would have been very defective and undernourished by the end of the first draft. But I am very attracted to that, what would you call it, that quintessential Australian landscape that's out there in the Cowra area, and to the great boulders that sit on the ridges, and to the sort of farming that goes on in such areas and has gone on since European settlement. And I knew that it was interesting to me that in that sort of Australian pastoral torpor, such dramatic events and such dramatic people should be set down. The Italians from North Africa and from Eritrea and similar places, and the Japanese from the Southwest Pacific. And that you therefore had three disparate worlds, because in the days of white Anglo-Saxon and Celtic Australia, even the Italians were considered extremely strange.
Yeah, well, the relationship, there's a wonderful love story that is developing as I read, and the relationship between this woman whose husband has been fighting in Europe, and so has gone to her quite a foreign place, and meeting up with this Italian who seems to be quite educated, willing to learn, and it surprises her. It surprises her the similarities it's from the beginning. That sort of creeping in of the relationship is wonderful to behold. That to me underlined the difference between European culture and the Japanese culture. There's a very stark difference in the book. How did you go about, researching the sort of the Japanese side of things?
Well, I read a great deal. I read material in the Australian archives. There is a novel on the matter by a Japanese writer called Asada, who posits that the fall of Saipan convinced the prisoners in the compound in Cowra that the war was going to end in a way that would compel them all the more to seek obliteration, that it was going to end in defeat. And then there are the books of Harry Gordon on this issue, and then there are earlier books on the Kara outbreak. But I couldn't have written that novel without the wonderful resources of the National Australian Archives, many of which are online. And it can't be underestimated the benefit that has come to novelists and historians from digitalized material. So you don't have to go down to Canberra to read it. You can sit at home and read it, and that was enormously valuable, including the Japanese reaction, which I mentioned at the end of the book. After the slaughter at Kara, the Japanese said these were obviously internees. They released a press statement in English. These were all obviously internees who had pre-war friends in Australia and maybe even girlfriends. And therefore it's a massacre, it's a murder, because we know that Japanese soldiers don't surrender. It was partly the official refusal to acknowledge the surrender of Japanese soldiers, and that Japanese soldiers could do so, that is to blame for what happened at Kara. That is a cultural indicator of the fact that these men felt, even though many of them didn't want to die, that they must.
Well, that leads me on to the next question, because what I find interesting is your two people in the one Tom Keneally. You're Tom Keneally, the historian, and Tom Keneally, the novelist. Is there a lot of bickering that goes on between the two? Because in one sense you could see that the novelist could be the tutor of the historian, the historian could be the tutor of the novelist. But I mean, with finding those details for a novelist wandering away from the facts and just and imagining what may have happened, how does that get resolved?
The Daughters of Mars, which is about World War I nurses, there is a cross-feeding, because I decided I'd write about World War I in large part from the point of view of the data that came out of the trenches, the material, the damaged material of young men that came out of the trenches, and the eloquent wounds that were dealt with by surgeons, nurses and orderlies. So I began reading nurses' journals, and that's where Daughters of Mars came from. I felt that this was separate. For history, you talk about the great argument with Japan that really began for us around about 1905, when the Japanese beat the Russian fleet, and when the British made a naval treaty with the Japanese, and we didn't want them to. And so the argument that comes to a culmination in Kara is also encapsulated in Kara, where you've got a mass of white Australia and the mass of the, by Japanese standards, almost depopulated countryside, and this pulsing core of young Japanese at its heart, and the two bound in mutual misunderstanding, and it seems to be almost a metaphor, a small metaphor for the war. And that's what novels are good at, looking at small, intimate things that illustrate the whole of history.
Yeah.
So I didn't, this research, any research I did for this was purely for the sake of the book itself, the novel itself. This book didn't come out of the historical research.
Right, so this wasn't, I mean, I like to think of a writer like yourself who does a lot of historical reading as the fiction being a release valve on the imagination, a way to deal with the information coming in. You have to let some out.
Yes,
Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. There are many stories you come across in history which I'd love to write. For example, Charles Dickens sent 2 sons to New South Wales in the 19th century. They had a dreadful time. They lived in places like Wilcannia. Anthony Trollope sent one of his sons, and they all knew each other. There was one time they all belonged to the same cricket club. These 3 sons of great Victorian novelists, and their story fascinates me because, and I came across them through the history because I was looking for evidence that the British middle class, not only British judges, but the British middle class chose Australia as the destination for their scholastically or morally unsuitable sons. And I wanted to write a novel about that. But that novel will probably never be written.
Oh. What are you wasting your time here with me? Off you go. Write that novel for me. I'd love to read that one. That sounds great. I love Dickens. I love Trollope. Thank you very much for speaking with me. I really recommend this novel. I've 120 pages in, and it's so complex. There's so many things going on. It keeps you up. I read till late at night last night. I'm really eager to find out where the love story goes because that is really well done. I'm really enjoying that, and the history of the Japanese soldiers coming through is remarkable. I haven't had that angle before in my reading, so I'm very pleased to be able to read that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thomas Keneally's new book, Shame of the Captives, is available now at booktopia.com.au.